Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you all. And we're glad to have you this morning for our commemoration of Tisha B'Av. This morning, we're going to have a chance to do a few things. The first is we're going to participate in the custom that's usually observed on Erev Tisha B'Av, which is to chant a little of Lamentations. And we will also have the opportunity to engage in a little study of one of the most famous passages in Talmud, the story of Kamza and barkumsa. And so we're going to invite you to just get comfortable. Tisha B'Av is a remarkable and unique commemoration in which we're invited to mourn, and in which we're invited to grieve in some respects, the greatest calamity the Jewish people ever faced. But at the same time, it's a complicated thing to celebrate, or to commemorate, I should say, Tisha B'Av in 2022 and 5782, because we live at a time when Jerusalem is rebuilt, when we have a strong and vibrant modern state of Israel, when we are able to be, in many ways, Jerusalem is redeemed. So when we think about what it is that we're mourning, most of us, I think, especially us as Reformed Jews, are not anxious for the rebuilding of the temple. We're not looking to move that mosque over. And so what it is that we're commemorating is a complicated thing. And there are many of my teachers who debate, do we continue to fast on Tisha B'Av? Do we continue to mourn on Tisha B'Av? What is the appropriate way in our modern day and age for us to commemorate? And part of what I am thinking is the best way for us to commemorate this act is to look at some of the spiritual themes that the sages found in what led to the cataclysm that was the destruction of Judea by the Romans and the eventual destruction of the temple yet to be rebuilt. So as we begin, we're going to invite you to just get into a more present space and join with me from the Book of Lamentations. Hashivenu, Hashivenu, Adonai Elecha, V'nashuva, V'nashuva, Kadesh, Kadesh, Yamenu Kekedesh. Hashivenu, Hashivenu, Adonai, Elecha, Venashuva, Venashuva, Chadesh, Chadesh, Yamenu Kekedem. There are a series of liturgical dirges that were written for Tisha B'Av called the keynote, some which were to be used in the evening, some in the morning. The third chapter of the keynote says the following: On this night my children weep and wail. On this night my house was destroyed and my palace burnt. And all the house of Israel cries and laments for the fires kindled by the Holy One. On this night wail bitterly you who has lost it all, who is separated from her father's house. She has left and shut the door, gone into captivity. On this night my children weep and wail. On this night the wheel of fortune spun to doom, my first and second homes destroyed. Hate conquering that of love, she is a living widow, an abandoned woman. On this night my children weep and wail. On this night of gloom the light has dimmed. My holy house is destroyed and the priestly watch discontinued. On this night woe covers and encircles me, a decree against our ancestors, denying them the Holy Land, afflicting them with sorrow and regret, a day destined for everlasting anguish. Echa yashva vadad, ha'ir rabati am, haita kamana, ravati bagoyim, sarati bamedinot, haita lamas, pachutiv ke balayla, vidimata alechya, en la menachem mikolo aveha, korecha bagduva, ayula lo yavim, galta Yehuda meoni, umerov avoda, yashva vagoyim, lo matza manoach, kol rodfei siguha ben amitzarim, darchei Tzion avelot, mibli bae moed, kol she'arecha shomemin, kohaneha nenachim, Betuleha nugot v'himala, hayutzareha lerosh, oiveha shalu, ki Adonai hoga, al rov pisha'eha, oleleha, al chushvi lifnei tzar. Echa, how can it be? She sat alone, the city so great, so swelled with people. She was like a widow, the one great among the nations, ministering among the states, became a slave caste. Crying, she will cry in the night, her tear upon her cheek. There is none for her, no comforter. From all her lovers, all her companions play traitor with her. They became for her enemies. She, Judah, was exiled by poverty and by so much hard labor. She sat among the nations, not finding any rest. All her pursuers caught up with her between the confined places. Zion's roads are mourning from being without festival goers, all her gates desolated. Her priests are moaning, her girls grieving, and it is bitterness for her. Her tormentors were at the head, her enemies had ease, for Adonai the Eternal aggrieved her for the greatness of her sins. Her babes walked captive before foe. And all her splendor went out from daughter Zion. Her ministers were like deer not finding a place to graze. And so they walked without strength before a pursuer. Jerusalem remembered the days of her poverty and affliction and all her downsliding, all her precious things which were from days long ago, while her people fell into a foe's hand, and there is no help for her. They saw her, her tormentors, laughing over her becoming stilled. Sinning, she sinned, Jerusalem, for this an outcast, Nidah she became. All who honor her despise her, for they saw her nakedness. Also her she is moaning and turned around backward. Her blood tum'ah, her shame in her skirts, and she didn't remember her end after. She descended wondrously. There is no comforter for her. Adonai, see my poverty and my humiliation, for an enemy became great. A foe, trauma, spread out his hand over all her precious things. She saw other nations come within her holy place, which you commanded her. They won't come in with the community to you. All her people are moaning, seeking bread. They gave up their precious things for food to restore life. See, Adonai, and look at how I was despised. Never to you all who pass on the way. All of you look and see, could there be pain like my pain, which was doled out to me, which Adonai caused to grieve in the day of God's furious anger? And now we're going to turn to the Talmud. In the Talmud, in Tractate Yoma, the rabbis ask, why was the first temple destroyed? And they said it was because of three things that existed at that time: idolatry, sexual immorality, and murder. The three cardinal sins, the three greatest trespasses a Jew can fulfill, the three things that the Torah and the rabbis teach that should you be asked to do one of those three things or you will be killed, you are asked to accept martyrdom. But then they asked the second temple, when the people were engaged in the study of Torah and fulfilled the commandments and performed Gimilut Chasadim, acts of kindness, well, why was that destroyed? And the answer they give is because of Sinat Chinam, because of baseless, senseless hatred. And from this, we learn the Talmud teaches that Sinat Chinam is considered equal to the three sins of idol worship, of sexual immorality, and murder. It's as if the sages teach in Tractate Yoma that there is a fourth cardinal sin that we need to attend to, which is this idea of Sinat Chinam, of baseless hatred. So, what is baseless hatred? How do we know if the hatred that we're carrying is baseless? Because the fact is, right, when we think about our hatreds, most of us think we have good basis for them. When we think about the aspersions that we cast on others, when we think about the ways in which we despise or condemn faults or trespasses that we see in others, very seldom do we think that that is senseless, right? We always think our hatred is justified. We always think that, the causes that we carry in our hearts are right. Very few people that I know say, no, I know I'm wrong, but I'm going to do it anyway. Most of us, when we think about what we do and how we behave and what we choose, are people who say, no, I've got a perfect right to do what I'm doing. How many of you know someone who doesn't speak to someone else in their family because they are absolutely sure they're right? And when someone, on the other hand, looks at sometimes those situations from the outside, all you can see is tragedy. I'm reminded of a story that I have shared on occasion. My sister has a very close friend from the time they were little girls. And it happened that her friend did not attend college. After 1 year, decided to drop out, and she went into hospitality and worked in the hotel industry. She's had actually a very successful career, and she fell in love with a guy who also did not go to college, who was an electrician. He had some learning issues, and college was not the right path for him. And her parents did not approve of her or her relationship with him. They moved in together and decided to get married. And at one day, they were on the phone. Stacy, my sister's friend, and her mother were on the phone. And her mother was kind of giving it to her. And David, her fiance at the time, said, "Why don't you tell that blobbity, blobbity, blobbity to go blobbity, 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 blue?" And her mother heard it. And she said, "I demand he apologize." And he said, "I'm not going to apologize because A, I am able to say whatever I want to say in the privacy of my own home. I'm sorry you overheard it. And B, I kind of meant it." And she said, "Well, if he won't apologize, I'm not coming to the wedding." And so everybody went to work. My sister and all their friends said to David, "Just apologize, just make peace. I mean, all right, so you're angry, and even if you're right, just make peace." My parents and all their friends went to Stacy's mother and said, "He's a kid, he's impulsive, just let it go. Is this really worth going to war over?" And it turned out that someone else walked Stacy down the aisle. Her parents and none of their family attended the wedding. And Stacy has 4 beautiful children who her mother has barely ever met. I think they met 3 times. So we take a look at this and we can say, Gewalt, right? What kind of hatred is this? What's the point, right? But if you talk to them, he should apologize. How can I have a relationship with someone who despises me? How can I have a relationship with someone who shows me no respect? So when we think about sort of how we consider hatred, right? What some people think of as justifiable hatred, other people say not so justified. And sometimes it takes a little bit of distance and space and objectivity to see what that requires. The Talmud presents a story much the same way, whose results were even more cataclysmic than the results of my friend and her family. And thus we'll get to the story of Kamza and barkumsa. And so if you'll say with me, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruling spirit of the universe, who has made us holy by giving us commandments to perform and commanded us to get busy with the study of Torah. Now, please, if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screens, for those who are less familiar, there is what's called reactions, and you can press that, and there is an electronic hand-raising tool that you can use if you have a question, if you'd like to participate. We begin. So the Gemara explains, Jerusalem was destroyed on account of Kamza and barkumsa. Now, we don't know who these people were, but when you look at Kamza and barkumsa, what do you naturally assume about the relationship between them?
They're related.
They're related, right? So someone in Aramaic, bar means ben, son of, right? So there is kind of this idea that Kamza and barkumsa are related. Perhaps barkumsa is even Kamza's son. It could mean that they're cousins, somehow related, okay? And so this man, whom we don't know, but who's going to play an incredibly important role in this narrative, had a friend who was Kamza, but his enemy was barkumsa. Now, why would it be that someone would be friends with a father and enemies with a son? What could be going on that might cause parents and children to be distanced from each other? Oh, I don't know, a gazillion things, right? But in this particular context, as they look around the time of the destruction of Judea, there were serious rifts in families about how the Jews should comport themselves with the Romans. And so there were some that taught that the best way to deal with the Romans was to go along and get along, and to cooperate as best you could and not make waves with the empire that controlled your area, your life, and your livelihood. And then there were others, zealots, who were called the Sicari. The Sicari were more in favor of mounting an armed rebellion against the Romans. Why would they have an idea that mounting an armed rebellion against the Romans would be a good idea? Is there a time in Jewish history when an armed rebellion was a success?
Well, they could think that God was with them, David.
Okay, if you thought God was with you, that would be a good reason to give it a whirl. And usually it's good to say, well, maybe we have experience in such things. Do the Jews ever have experience with overthrowing an evil empire? Sure we do, right? They're the Maccabees. King Antiochus from Assyria comes, invades, and conquers Judah. And Judah, right? Matityahu, the Kohen, the priest, right? And has 5 sons, and they mount a guerrilla campaign over 4 years and eventually rebel and create the Hasmonean Empire dynasty, right? Which was the precursor to ultimately the Greeks and the Romans. So they have, in not distant memory, right? The Hasmonean revolt was between 168 and 164 BCE. And so it was only a couple hundred years before that they had, within, recent memory, a rebellion that worked. And so there were many zealots, the Sicari, that believed the best way to deal with the Romans was to mount an armed revolt. Now, who do you think were the people who were more in favor of the revolt? The parents or the kids?
The kids.
Right, because the kids are a little bit more idealistic, they're a little stronger, and why would the adults be a little less likely to want to go along with an armed revolt? They've got more to lose, right? The adults are more established in their businesses, they're more established in their privileges, they're more established in their lives. They don't want to rock the boat. So whoever this man is, okay, he was a prominent man, and interestingly, the Talmud does not name him, okay? They name only these other 2 people. He has a friend whose name is Kamza, and he has an enemy whose name was barkumsa. And he once made a large feast, and he said to his servant, go and invite my friend Kamza to come to this, call it a society affair. And the servant made a mistake and instead didn't bring Kamza, he brought barkumsa. And so now, do you think barkumsa knows that he just got invited to his enemy's dinner party? Yeah, it wasn't like he didn't know the guy was his enemy. If you have an enemy, do you usually know that that person thinks you're an enemy? Yeah, it's not usually a secret, right? So in this case, he gets invited to his enemy's dinner party. Now, if you're someone who gets invited to an enemy's dinner party, what might you presume or figure that invitation means? Yeah, Bobby, what do you think?
You might think it was a peace offering.
Yeah, you might think it's a peace offering. You might say, oh, he must want to put bygones and bygones away. You know what? That's a beautiful thing. Maybe I'll go make peace with this man. Okay. If you thought something else, you wouldn't go, would you? Right? So would you assume it was a mistake?
He might go.
Maybe
Anyhow.
yes, maybe no. But in this case, he decides to go. So the man who was hosting the feast came and found Bar Kamsa sitting at the feast. After all, he was invited. And then he says to Bar Kamsa, that man is the enemy, the Baal Devava of that man. In other words, he's saying, you're my enemy. What are you doing here? Get up and get out. Kum lech is what it says. Arise and leave. It's not very gracious, right? So the man says, listen, since I already came, let me stay and I'll give you money for whatever I need. You don't have to host me. Just don't embarrass me by sending me out. Now, why would this man want him to leave so badly?
He really can't stand him. He really believes he's his enemy and he shouldn't be there.
Okay, good. So maybe he's just a mean, bitter, scornful SOB, right? What might be another reason why he wouldn't want Bar Kamsa to be there, besides just plain old bitterness?
It could be about power.
Could be about power, right? And it could also be about endorsement. If all of society is there and they see someone from the other side sitting there, what have you done to the other side? You validated them. You've endorsed them, right? So what is the first thing that happens with senseless hatred? So whatever the reasons are, they're on different sides of a thing, right? And sometimes it's legit to have enemies, right? Sometimes it's legit to have somebody that you detest because of who they are, what they've done, or what they stand for. And maybe you say, if I have you under my roof, what I'm really doing is saying who you are and what you've done is okay by me. I can't have anybody wondering if what you've done is okay by me. You need to get out. So the guy says, listen, don't embarrass me. Don't shame me, right? Just give me the money and I'll just pay. And so the host says, no, you have to leave. Then Bar Kamsa says to him, I'll pay for half the party. Just don't send me away. The host says to him, no, you have to leave. Bar Kamsa says, I'll pay for the whole thing. Just don't make me leave. And he said, no, you must leave. And finally, he took Bar Kamsa by the hand, stood him up, and took him out. So what's happened to Bar Kamsa at this feast?
He's been humiliated.
He's been humiliated. He's been shunned. He's been castigated, right? He's been told what Joseph's brothers told him, I can't even say shalom to you. And of course, we kind of know what happened with Joseph and his brothers, right? So clearly, whoever Bar Kamsa was, if he can actually offer to pay for this entire feast, he must have been a fairly wealthy, prominent guy himself, right? So not only has the host disparaged Bar Kamsa, what has he also done? He's belittled him in the eyes of his own followers, of his own posse, of his own crew. So the humiliation might be not only his personal humiliation, but it's also a rejection of everything and everyone that he cares about. And so he says to himself, since the sages were sitting there and did not protest, although they saw how humiliated he was, learn from it that they were content. So now he says, hey, not only did this guy kick me out of his house and humiliate me, what makes it worse? All of the sages, the leaders of that time, those who are not just the political leaders of that time, though they are that too, but the moral arbiters of that time, sat there and did nothing. Now, why would the sages not have done anything? Well, if they really saw a moral trespass, wasn't it their obligation to do tochacha, to do rebuke, to say, hey, you can't do that? Bobby, go ahead.
Well, you would think they would. You would think they would, but maybe they were hypocrites and they were just going to take the easy road out and not make trouble, keep their own positions.
Okay, good. Jack, what do you think?
Could they also have thought that this was planned by him to invite this man and then embarrass him in front of everybody, in a way decreasing the respect for Kamza for doing what he did to barkumsa?
Right. So it could be, right, that maybe barkumsa is thinking to himself, this whole thing was a setup to make a point, right? To make a particular point about me and about what I believe and about who I am and about sort of what it's all about, right? And so it may be, right, that it happens that whoever this host was, right, says, if we rebuke our host, we're giving a tacit endorsement to the beliefs of barkumsa too. And we don't want to give an endorsement to what that person believes. So even though we see a big injustice being perpetrated against this man, we don't want to make it seem like we endorse what he stands for. So what do? You do nothing. Margaret, go ahead.
Well, it could be fear. I mean, perhaps who's the person, not Kamsa, who's the other one who's giving the feast? Who's the one that's giving the feast?
We don't know. Some guy.
Okay,
right?
okay.
Some prominent
So
socialite.
he's giving it, and the other people there, they just, they're people who don't know how to stand up. They're fearful. They're unsure of themselves. And they just don't have, I won't use a vernacular term. They just don't have the
Enough backbone, right?
the backbone. That was good to do so. That's it.
Right. And that's part of, isn't that sometimes like what causes the destruction of a society, right? All it takes for the destruction of the good is for good people to do nothing, right? I'm paraphrasing a more famous quote. So it happens that he's mad, okay? And so because he's mad and the establishment, the society doesn't protect him and doesn't call out the immoral act perpetrated against him, he says, I'm going to go and I'm going to burn down the whole thing. I would rather burn down everything than let them get away with this. And so watch what he does. He went and said to the emperor, now, like, he gets on a boat and goes to Rome here, okay? So whoever Bar Kamsa was a prominent enough guy that he could get on a boat and go to Rome and get an audience with the emperor. So he himself had to be someone of reasonable renown, right? I can't just go to the emperor. Some average Jewish schnook just can't leave Judea and say, I'd like to see the emperor, please, right? So he goes and he says to them, to the leader, to the emperor, to the Caesar, the Jews have rebelled against you. And the emperor doesn't believe it. And so he said, who says? And Bar Kamsa says back, test them. Send them an offering to be brought in honor of the government and see if they'll take it. Okay. Now, is it likely that the Romans know the rules of how Jewish sacrifice works?
Probably not in great detail.
They probably know some, but they probably don't know all. So what would be one thing that you would assume that the Romans would know? Don't send a pig, right? Don't send lobster. If you want them to make an offering, would it be likely that the Romans would know what kind of offering that the Jews would accept? Yeah. Herod built this magnificent, gorgeous, glamorous temple. People from all over the Roman world would come to Judea just to see it. And what would they see when they would go up on the Temple Mount? They'd see a bunch of Jews bringing sheep and goats and bulls and cows and whatever, turtles. They would see them and they would say, oh, okay, I know what the Jews take. They take, cattle. They don't take pork. They'll know, right? This isn't a secret. So what does the emperor do? He chooses the nicest animal he can, right? A 3-year-old calf. And what they don't know, the Romans, are the levels of impurities that would render what would seem a healthy, fit animal unfit for sacrifice. And what would make a healthy animal unfit for sacrifice? A blemish of some kind, a wound, a scar, something that would then make it unfit. So Bar Kamsa knows the rules. So he takes back this animal with him to the temple. But what does he do? He takes his knife and he puts a blemish on the calf's upper lip. Now, why is that the blemish that he would make? Well,
About speech.
right, it may be, well, I don't know. I don't know if the calf is talking so much, but that's a good idea. Yeah, Jack, why would they pick that?
It's an obvious place where people would look. I mean, it's staring you right in the face, this blemish.
Right, from up close. But from a distance, would you be able to tell?
Not necessarily.
Probably not, right?
By the way, is Barkumsa Jewish? Because according to this theory, he isn't when he says the Jews have rebelled. By the name Barkumsa, I would assume he was a Jew.
The implication is that he's Jewish, but what does he say when he says the Jews have rebelled against you? He is setting himself apart from his own people, right? And, it calls to mind the admonition in Pirkei Avot that, is probably even in response to this and other things. Al tifrosh minat tzibur, do not separate yourself from the community. And so in this way, he is separating himself out from his people. And so he creates this blemish in a place that most people wouldn't even see. Some said they even made it on the eyelid, right? Which according to us, to Jews, that's a blemish that you can't use, but maybe to Gentiles, they don't care, right? A broken leg, they might say, oh, okay. But this is something that would not necessarily be apparent. So Now the sages have a problem. What's the problem? If they don't offer this sacrifice, they'll have rejected a gift from the emperor. Is there ever a time when rejecting a gift from the emperor is a good idea? Right? On the other hand, what's the other problem? It's treif, right? It's an impure sacrifice. So, the blemish notwithstanding, the sages say, close your eyes and take the offering, because it's more important that you make peace with the Romans than to stand on principle. So there's a Rabbi Zachariah ben Avkolis, who said, but if we offer it, people are going to say that, it's okay to sacrifice blemished animals on the altar. So then the sages say, all right, let's not sacrifice it. But then what do we need to do? We need to make sure the Romans don't find out that we didn't take the sacrifice. How are you going to make sure the Romans don't find out that they refrain from taking the sacrifice? You got to off barkumsa, right? He's the guy who's creating all of the problems. So dispatch him, right? Make him an offer he can't refuse. Let him be neighbors with Jimmy Hoffa. Do something, right? Get rid of him. He is an existential threat to the people. And so the sages say, maybe we should kill him, and then he won't speak against us anymore. And Reb Zachariah says, but if you kill him, you're saying that if you make a blemish on a sacrificial animal, that's a capital crime. You can't, that's not a capital crime. Bobby, go ahead.
I think the responsibility lies with the sages who did nothing at the party.
Uh-huh. And now, right, they're trying to do something, but what's the problem with the sages? They have this sage, Rabbi Zachariah, literally the righteous one of God. That's what his name means, right? Or remembered by God. What's the problem with Zachariah? He's obtuse, right? He's more concerned that they should follow the halakha than recognizing that there's an existential threat present to the people, to his entire society, to the temple even itself. And so because they couldn't decide what to do, right? They didn't do anything. And so barkumsa says, I told you they wouldn't take your sacrifice. Now, back then, you didn't have a hotline, right, between Rome and Jerusalem to say, listen, let me explain what happened here, right? They just know that he didn't take the sacrifice, right? And so they say that's how the war between the Jews and the Romans began. And Rabbi Yochanan says it was the excessive humility, the punctiliousness of Rabbi Zachariah ben Avkolis that destroyed the temple, burned our sanctuary, and exiled us from our land. That if it weren't for his so-unquote piety, his standing on ceremony, not being able to see the forest for the trees, that led to the entirety of the destruction. Now, why would Yochanan say it was, it wasn't, the host's fault or barkumsa's fault or the Romans' fault? Why is he laying the blame on this rabbi who's just trying to interpret the law? Because in some respects, what Rabbi Yochanan is saying is that Rabbi Zachariah ben Avkolis has created and perpetrated the greatest idolatry of all, which was what? Just worshiping the law, instead of realizing that the law is meant to create and to serve a people who are trying to establish a holy society. So one of the things that you see in the context of senseless hatred, right, is when you hide behind the law without thinking of the consequence of what that is going to do in the broader context. So when you see people saying, what am I going to do? The Constitution says, my interpretation of it, right? They're missing, right, the fact that the Constitution was established to form a more perfect union, and there are people's lives at stake that we're talking about here. So then, as the war begins, the Roman authorities send Nero to start the war. And so now there's this great little piece of midrash. When he came to Jerusalem, he wanted to see if God really wanted this war. So he shot an arrow to the east, and the arrow fell in Jerusalem. All right. Then he shot another arrow to the other direction, and what happened? It also fell in Jerusalem. He fired his bow in all directions. No matter what happened, the arrow went to Jerusalem. And then he says, wait a minute, now it looks like maybe God wants me to do this. So he grabs a kid and he says, what'd you learn in school today? And he said, we learned a verse that says, I will lay my vengeance upon Edom by the hand of my people Israel. Now, Edom in ancient times, the Edomites were synonymous with the Romans. And so it's almost like saying, I'm going to lay my vengeance on the Romans by the hand of the Israelites. So how does Nero said? The Holy One wishes to destroy his temple, and he wishes to wipe his hands with that man, meaning the ones who are going to destroy the temple. So Nero is the one who sees the future. And what's the future? The future is the Romans are going to destroy the temple, and God is going to have vengeance against the Romans. Interestingly, the great sage, right, Zachariah ben Avkolis can't see the future, but the Roman guy can, right? Rather than participate in something that would bring about the destruction of Rome, what does Nero do? He ran away, he converted to Judaism, and ultimately, the great sage Rabbi Meir was one of his descendants. So what do the Romans do? They send another general, right? They send Vespasian. And he came and laid siege to Jerusalem for 3 years. Now, what's a siege? Why do sieges work?
Well, they're battles, they're fierce, and they're usually one-sided.
It stars
Okay.
out your opponents.
Say it again, Jack.
It stars out your opponents and they give up.
Right. When you lay siege, you build a wall, or you create a boundary around a place so that no provisions can get in and no people can get out. This was a very common tactic for war in ancient times and a very common tactic for war in modern times. Can anyone name a famous siege, right, during the war in Judea? You can still see evidence of the siege if you go there today.
The destruction of the Second Temple.
Right, in Jerusalem, right? Harder to see the evidence of it, but if you go a little bit south and you go to Masada, you can still see the siege wall that surrounds the mountain. And more recently, the siege of Jerusalem in 1948 and 47, when the Arab armies surrounded Jerusalem and wouldn't let any provisions, and the Jews were starving there. And that was the creation of the famous Burma Road, the back way into Jerusalem. You can take a Jeep and go on the Burma Road today. And And that's how they were able to finally carve a path to bring supplies to the starving people in Jerusalem during the war for Israel's independence. What can you do to make a siege fail? Make sure there's enough provisions that you can't starve them out, right?
Yeah.
So if you've been to Masada, raise your hand if you've been to Masada. What did they have on the surface of Masada that made the siege of Masada impossible? Carlos. Yep, Carlos, we lost you.
No, I'm still here. I was
Okay.
just muted.
Big wall,
That's all.
a big hill.
Yeah.
What do they have
Yeah,
on top of Masada that made the siege a failure?
They had cisterns.
They had water.
Tons of water, and what else?
They had
They had
storerooms.
walls protecting.
A very high.
Right, they had high walls, right? They were able to throw, boulders down on the soldiers trying to come up. But why weren't they able to starve them out? Because
They had food.
Because they had storage of food.
they had years and years and years worth of grain on top of that mountain, and all the water they could need because of the great cisterns that were dug into the side of the mountain that captured the rains from the flash floods. And so there are 3 in Jerusalem that have the power to break the siege. And so we're going to learn about these guys. Okay. So there were at that time in Jerusalem 3 wealthy people: Nakdimon ben Gurion, ben Kalba Savua, and ben Tzitzit HaKasat. All right, these 3 wealthy dudes. And they offered their assistance. And one said to all the leaders of the city, "Don't worry about the siege. I'll feed everybody that lives here with wheat and barley." And the other guy said, "Don't worry. I've got plenty of wine and salt and oil." And the other one said, "I'll give them wood." And so the Gemara comments that the sages gave special praise to the one who gave the wood, because that's the most expensive gift. Because in order to, have enough wood for a fire, right, to be able to cook everything, you need a lot more. So they say 1 storehouse of wheat requires 60 storehouses of wood for cooking and baking and fuel and whatever, right? Cold winters in Jerusalem and what have you. So you have these 3 wealthy people. Commentators tell you a little bit about their names. One that's kind of interesting is Ben Kalba Savua. A kelev is a dog, right? And Savua means satisfied. So they say that Ben Kalba Savua was so generous that you would come into his house hungry as a dog and leave Savua. You would leave satisfied. Ben Tzitzit HaKasat says that the guy's tzitzit would never touch the ground because he had so much money that he had servants that would lay blankets on the ground as he would walk so that his feet never touched the ground and his tzitzis would never touch the ground either. That's good money. If you can pay someone or a group of people to constantly be putting blankets down so you don't have to step on the stone. Not a bad life. I don't have anybody like that, but maybe some of you do. And so now what's the problem? These 3 wealthy men had between them enough commodities to sustain Jerusalem for 21 years. What's the problem? Sounds great. But then if you're one of the Sikari, if you're one of the zealots, why is that a problem? Because maybe now you can't go to war, right? Now you don't have a good reason to inspire people to join you in revolting against the Romans. If you're comfortable and if you're okay, then you're not going to go make peace, right? So the sages said to the zealots, "Hey, you know what? They can't beat us. It's a stalemate. Let's go and make a deal." But the zealots said, "Over my dead body, am I going to let you go and make a deal with the enemy?" The zealots said to the sages, "Let's go out and fight them." But the sages said, "You're going to lose. It's the Romans," right? Eventually, the Romans are going to get tired of being here in this siege mode and wait till they say, I'm going home. So what do the zealots do to force the people to go engage in battle? The zealots rose and burned the storehouses so that there would be a famine. So think about how much the zealots had to hate the establishment that they would literally burn their own supplies. They would literally destroy their own wherewithal. That their hatred was so profound that they were willing to even hurt themselves. They were willing to participate in an act of such extraordinary self-destruction that it was ultimately enough, that they were willing to just let it go.
I think
Then
we've
with
seen that lately.
What's that?
I think we've seen that lately.
We're seeing that in all kinds, right, in different societies. With regard to this famine, it is related that Marta bat Baitos, okay? So this is a Jewish woman who has Greek ancestry, right? She's one of the assimilated, was one of the real wealthy women in Jerusalem. And so she sent out her agent and said, hey, go get me some of like really good flour. It's called smidah. And by the time he went out, it was all gone. There wasn't any left in the marketplace. So he came back and he said, we don't have any of this smidah, but we got regular flour. So she says, fine, go get me regular flour. But by the time he went back to the market, that was all gone. So he came back to her and says, there's no ordinary flour, but there's gush kera, which is like coarse flour. She said, fine, go get that. And by the time he came back, that was gone. So he came and he said to her, there's no coarse flour, but there is barley flour. Anybody ever cook with barley flour? Not delicious. Okay, but she says, fine, go get barley flour. But once again, by the time he got to the market, there was no barley flour left. So she said, right, now what's going on with this servant? Right?
He's
that he
idiot.
goes and he, what's wrong with him?
He's stupid.
Okay, is he stupid? What's he symbolic of? Why are the rabbis telling us about this schnook?
He only does what someone tells him to do. He's one of these people who doesn't think.
Right, he's kind of like an automaton, right? He's kind of like he has no awareness of what's really going on here, right? He thinks it's going to be okay. He's afraid to say to the leaders, you're going to have to make a change, right? You're not going to be able to live the life that you used to lead, right? The zealots have literally burned it. It's not, this is changing. This is falling apart. And so, right, she says, she had just sort of taken off her shoes, but she said, fine, I'll go out and see if I can find something to eat. And what happens to her when she goes out and she walks? She steps in a pile of poop.
Poo.
And she's so grossed out, she died. There are those who say, however, that she didn't step on dung, but rather she ate a fig of Rabbi Tzadok and became disgusted and died, meaning like she ate something from the enemy and that was worse. So what's the matter with the figs of Rabbi Tzadok? So Rabbi Tzadok, the rabbi the righteous is what his name means, right? Observe fast for 40 years, praying that Jerusalem would not be destroyed. And he became so emaciated from fasting that when he would eat something, it was visible from the outside of his body. It's like, when a snake eats something big, you can watch it go all the way down. They're saying he was so skinny that he would eat something, it would just, you could watch it go down. And he would eat after a fast. They'd bring him figs and he would suck out the liquid and cast it away. And so what did Marta Baitos find? She ate the outside of the fig that had no juice in it, right? And that's what caused her death. So this famine was so severe, right? But the last piece is that as she was dying, she took all of her gold and silver and threw it in the market. And she said, what do I need all this for? As it's written in the book of Ezekiel, they shall cast their silver in their streets, and their gold shall be as an impure thing. Their silver and their gold shall not be able to deliver them in the day of the wrath of the Lord. They shall not satisfy their souls, neither fill their bowels. And if we think about this, it's also in reflection of the words of the book of Lamentation that we read earlier. See what a glutton I've become for selling my treasures for a loaf of bread. So when we look at this story of Kamza and barkumsa, where do you see senseless hatred? And what came of it? What's the first piece of senseless hatred?
Him kicking him out of the party.
Right, saying that even if you have ideas that are complete anathema to mine, it's more important for me to disparage or to discount or distance myself from the ideas or run the risk of endorsing them or an apparent endorsement of them than to treat you like a human being. Right? What's the second piece of senseless hatred?
See, to me, it's the whole thing is it's a chain. And it just shows you how it just takes one action and it just spreads like this. It goes every direction into society. And even though only one thing happened that could have been squelched, but because of that one action, all hell breaks loose, so to speak.
Yeah, Jack.
You know, the other thing that I see here is obviously these actions led to the fall of Jerusalem, which is now, you know, we look upon the 9th of Av as one of the major things that we see in the 9th of Av. But there is another story, the story of, and I've forgotten, I think it's a midrash, where the Sanhedrin meets and they meet again and they discuss doing an action against God, and God laughs because they finally have taken responsibility for taking charge of their lives. Here too, if the powers that be realized what possibly could lead, what their actions could lead to, they would have sacrificed that blemished lamb. And for all I know, God would have looked at this favorably, not as something that they shouldn't have done, but something that would have saved you know, the whole city.
Right. So when we think about, you know, what we're willing to stand on ceremony for, right, and what we're willing to go to the mats for, sometimes we have to have some greater understanding of context. Yeah, Todd.
I'm sorry.
And to your question earlier, the first thing you have to have is intolerance for the other person's ideas.
Yeah, you have to be unwilling, right, to allow for the fact that you may not be right, right? So if you look at how this story progresses, right, there's a complete intolerance for whatever barkumsa represents. And there is a complete intolerance by barkumsa for what they represent, right? So barkumsa is unwilling to say, well, maybe the sages have a reason why they can't endorse me. Maybe I need to go look in the mirror a little bit and wonder, why is it that the sages, those who are, you know, would say better he should be humiliated than it is that we should endorse what he, right? Because what do we find out about barkumsa? He's a treasonous guy. Maybe the sages are well within their bounds to reject him. After all, if he's the kind of guy that's willing to go to the Romans and sell out his entire people, right, then maybe they had a justification. On the other hand, right, if you know that you're dealing with someone who might be that destructive, is the way to deal with that person through casting them out and aspersions, or by bringing them close, by saying, I know you hate, but we want you to learn to love? Yeah, Todd, you had another thought?
Do you think he was one of the first zealots? Because it seems like is just like these zealots who didn't want to live under the Roman rule. Like
Right,
he
it's
started the
interesting,
whole
we
process.
don't
If you
know
look at the
what
big
his
picture.
issues were, right? It would seem odd that the zealots who want to fight against the Romans would go and say, hey, they're revolting against you. But it could be as well, right? But then when you take a look at the sages, right? Is hatred always like a thing where you know, come from an emotive place? So for example, if you take like what's happened at the Western Wall in recent weeks, where you have young ultra-nationalist Haredi Jews interfering with the bar bat mitzvah of American Jews in the egalitarian section, or the incredible vitriol and violence that's visited on women of the wall when they want to just stand in the back of the plaza and have a prayer service with women. Those people will tell you their hatred is completely justified. Why? Because the law says. The law says. But what happens when we start worshiping the law instead of the God who authored and inspired it? And I think that's an element of senseless hatred also, is when we justify our actions by saying, well, the Torah says, right, or God said, and in pretending that we have the ability or even audacity to speak for God in our own human position. Yeah, Jack.
But Barkumsa, at the beginning of this story, he attended an affair of an enemy thinking that they could come to an agreement. With that, he was slapped in the face and escorted out, and he became embarrassed, which is turning him back to the hatred of which was going on around him.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, Margaret.
You know, a lot of this has to do with hindsight. People behavior so often is, like you say, is emotional. It's quick. It's without thinking. And this whole story is, to me, it's an example of how we need to think before we act, or, ponder something. If we think we're going to do, give some time to think about what you're going to do, and which we don't do quite often because we are emotional animals. But
Right.
it's
right. This idea of you have to
teaches us
think
that.
about the consequences of what it is that you think your principle is going to lead to. Yeah, Evelyn.
Hi, I think that there are ways with interpretation to treat people like human beings at an event or at a party like Kamza or Kamza, but to make it very well known that you don't agree with that person. It doesn't mean you have to show hatred or vitriolity or evilness, but you can make it very well known that you don't agree with this person, but you accept this person being in the room with you.
The interesting thing is there was in ancient times a very, very serious rift between those who followed Hillel and those who followed Shammai. And the amazing thing is that even in the midst of all of their disputes, which were in some cases even violent, they still would let their kids marry each other. They would still say, yeah, I disagree and I think he's wrong and I don't subscribe to it, but you know what? You can marry my daughter. And what's lost in this story, right, is the idea of having enough humility and openness to say, even if you disagree with me, we can still be kin. we can still be family. We can still be one. And ultimately, I think that part of what we learn when they say that societies are destroyed by senseless hatred is when someone in a society says, you are not allowed, or I will not tolerate you in my society because I disagree with you, because you represent something that I abhor. And I think that oftentimes we're very good at talking about what we abhor, right? And justifying our hatred, but we sometimes, even in our sense of righteousness, I think don't always recognize how we ourselves contribute to what can undercut and destroy the foundations of our society. Judith.
Not being righteous is very difficult.
Well, for so many years at the beginning of the modern state of Israel, you saw that dichotomy, and you saw the Ashkenazi against the Sephardi, and they wouldn't allow their children to marry, and they wouldn't allow for certain things. And it's taken a long, long time for that to finally resolve itself. But
it's been replaced by different rifts.
Yeah.
Replaced by different rifts, right? Jack.
Right.
You can comment on this, and I know you will, but I see this a little differently now. If you take the Purim story, one Jew not bowing down would have resulted in the killing of all Jews. In this story, one Jew, even though it was by another Jew, I think that sentence that in the story you had said that all the Jews should be punished for this. And even today, we realize that one Jew, we say to ourselves, that person had to be a Jew, because I think a lot of society depicts one person, one Jew representing all of us. And I see that in these two stories. I don't know if anyone else does.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that's, it's an interesting, thing, but the difference was what was Mordecai standing up for in the Purim story? He was standing up for, basic principles of God, right?
Yep.
And what is barkumsa standing up for? What is the host standing up for? What are the sages standing up for? And the fact is that the sages didn't stand up for the humanity, right, of another Jew. They were too locked into the principles. And I think that part of what we learn is we have to learn to see the forest for the trees and to cultivate a measure of humility. So I want to wish those of you who are fasting, which I'm not sure there are any, an easy fast today, a meaningful fast. But we encourage you to join us on Tuesday for Lunch and Learn, as Rabbi Weissman continues to teach us about magic tradition in Judaism. And with Lunch and Learn on our friend Honi the Circle Maker. And also to remind you that next Friday night and Saturday, we're blessed to have a special guest, which is Dr. Rachel Schreiber, who on Friday evening is going to be talking a little bit about Tu B'Av. She is the director of the Parsons School of Design in New York. And then on Saturday, there will not be regular Torah study, but at Temple in person at 10:30 a.m., Dr. Schreiber is going to be teaching us a little bit about her book, in which she will teach us about Elaine Black-Yoneda, who was a Jew who spent time in a concentration camp in Japan during World War II. It's really an incredible and kind of a fascinating story. We ask you please to register to participate in that, but we will give you free bagels, which is, I think, a reasonable trade, don't you? And we look forward to seeing you all. And thank you for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed